Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Brandon Hamber, and I'm the John Hume and Tip O'Neill Chair in Peace here at Ulster University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the campus tonight. We're going to go through a few welcome formalities at the start, and then we will be moving into the lecture with Candice Mama, the talk, followed by a Q&A session with Leona O'Neill from the university. But I'll keep us moving along as we do that. But as is customary at the university, I'm going to get our Director of Regional Engagement, Malachy O'Neill, just to say an official welcome to the university, and then we'll kick proceedings off.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Delighted to be here this evening. Delighted to have Candice here as our guest speaker. My role at the university is Director of Regional Engagement, which pretty much means that I look after a lot of the elements of our people, place and partnership strategy. And the partnership that we enjoy with the Hume Foundation is a very unique one, a very special one. It's one that sits very well with our research and teaching activity. It complements beautifully the work that Brandon does as the Hume O'Neill Chair, and we're delighted that in this week where we had I see Roberta's in the audience this evening as well, we unveiled the third of our permanent exhibits of the Conflict Textiles collection across our three university campus libraries. And then of course tomorrow we'll have our very unique Leaders of the Future 25 at 25 cohort here on campus for one of their boot camp sessions, really shaping, forming and moulding the leaders of the future, and learning from some brilliant examples in terms of that leadership journey. So you're all very welcome here this evening. Céad míle fáilte agus bunaí sult as an ihe. Gur mai, Brandon.
So thanks, Malachy. I appreciate that. And thank you all again for coming. I'm just going to take 2 minutes just to contextualize a little bit of the visit of Candice and how it fits into our partnerships and a wider program that's been going on. Firstly, to say that this visit has been a very, very long time in the making. I, as a student, had a lecturer, and I was going to my first conference, and I said to the lecturer, what do I do with this thing? And the lecturer said, look, just keep it really simple. Whenever you go to a conference, all you want to do is make one lasting contact and learn one new idea. Don't do anything else. And for about 30 years, that's pretty much been my philosophy of going to conferences. And 5 years ago, when it was the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and the British Council had this large conference in Belfast, and I heard Candice speak for the first time. I'd known a little bit about her, but I heard her speak for the first time. And true to my little philosophy, I thought, that's the person I'm going to get to know. And so bravely, I went over and I introduced myself to Candice. I'm also from South Africa. And we, started a bit of a correspondence, and then I was in South Africa when she launched her book, Forgiveness Redefined, and I said to her, I want you to come back, and I want you to engage with young people and a different set of people when you come and visit. So we got that all set up, and we set the date for March 2020, which turned out, as many of you know, not to be the best possible date for organizing a large event. And so it got put off, and it got put off, and it got put off. And here we are today. But the interesting part of that story is in the middle of that, we started a new set of work with the John and Pat Hume Foundation, with Community Dialogue, with with the Integrated Education Fund, with Hollywood Trust, with Youth Action, with the Northern Ireland Youth Forum, and supported by the International Fund for Ireland. And it was called the Peace Summit. And the idea behind this group of people coming together was to ask the question, now 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, what are still the outstanding issues of the peace process? So in the time that it took to get Candice here, this partnership has flourished. We had a large peace summit last year. Today we were with nearly 100 young people talking about their aspirations for peace through the Peace Summit, and largely supported by the Hume Foundation. So in fact, by the time it came around, I feel like we were in a better place than we were in March 2020. We have this larger process that Candice has now fitted in, and it was fantastic today to see her interacting and working with the young people. And so this lecture and talk and tonight is part of that wider process. So where you see these banners that say Youth Peace Summit, that was about the events today. So I want to thank all those partners. I'm going to thank you now at the start, and particularly also thank the International Fund for Ireland, who've supported that process and made all of this possible. And so I'm going to turn to Paddy Hart, the chair of International Fund for Ireland, just to say a few words, and then we'll kick off. Thanks, Paddy.
Thanks, Brandon. Absolutely delighted to be here representing the fund. I chair a wonderful organisation. I'm really looking forward to hearing a very inspiring and thought-provoking conversation with Candice. We spoke a little bit, and I promise I won't say anything that we said earlier. You all know who Candice is now, so I bypass on that. I just go to say that we're really proud that we started the relationship with the Peace Summit and with the Pat and John Hume Foundation. Back in 23, as Brandon has talked about, we really talked about our journey towards what peace looked like coming up to the celebrating of the Good Friday Agreement, 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And then earlier today, on Summit 24, we looked at the engagement with young people and just their vision for the future. We're really looking forward to the outcome of that. Most of us in this room will know that sharing thoughts and experiences from a wide range of individuals and groups who in some way or other have been involved in peace building allows us to get a better understanding of where we are and gets a better understanding of the journey that other people are making. So we like to call them that these are the stories of everyday peacemakers. I think it's important, we were just sharing this earlier, that the role of everyone in the process of getting to peace is recognised, and we're very keen to make sure that we do more things like what we're doing with the Peace Summit, where it involves everyone. It's everyone's responsibility. Traditionally, it has been the responsibility of people who are involved in peace work. But until it's embraced by everyone, then we run the risk of it not being protected by everyone. And we're very keen to make sure we do that. And talking about everyday peace builders, many of you may or may not know that the genesis of the International Fund for Ireland happened within a mile of here. Two peace builders, one well-known, John Hume, internationally, one well-known locally, Paddy Bogside Derry, most people in the room will know both of them. So how the International Fund came about was they were bringing Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the US to look at what was happening, and they noted that an awful lot of young people were rioting and seemed to be on the streets and were vulnerable to getting involved in the violence. And Tip O'Neill said, well, how can we solve this? And John Newman and Paddy said, financial package. And eventually, over a lot of work, and Mark Durkan was a big player in negotiating that as well, ended up the International Fund for Ireland being set up by the British and Irish governments, the first practical body that they'd set up since the beginning of the state. So that's how significant an organisation it was then, and continues to be. So, with the British and Irish governments, the US government, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and for a little while the EU came on board. And what's important about that is that it balanced all the different constituencies that had to be on board. So it's international, it's cross community, it's diasporas that are both nationalist diasporas, unionist diasporas. So it's a really important organisation in that regard. Since 1986, all of those partners have invested just shy of billion euro. And in that billion euro, there's something like, in measurable terms, there's something like 50,000 jobs and about 8,000 projects. But more importantly, it's been about building relationships and about building leadership and about getting young people as emerging leaders. And we're very proud about all of that. And again, just before I finish, it's important to recognise just the really significant role that the international funds have played. At one level, the way that it was structured meant that public servants, civil society, and private sector could work together on a cross-border basis with international money, which was independent of exchequers. And at that point, the only cross-border body that existed on the island of Ireland was the Foyle Fisheries Commission. Many of you may know as the water rats. But the police, that comes from someone who grew up at the border. So that's a very parochial term for those who necessarily had to police the waters. So it was the first organisation that made that possible. So whenever you look at the joint ministerial bodies now, they're all big cross-border bodies. They were easier because the relationships had already been built by working together on projects that were international and Ireland projects. And secondly, because we are international, the governments allowed us to be innovative, allowed us to take risks, allowed us to come up with models, fail, but predominantly succeed in models that we're very keen now to, well, first of all, to learn what Candice is going to tell about her journey, and also for us to share what we've learned elsewhere. As we just said at the end, and I'll finish on this, Candice says not many people actually know what the success story of the peace process is here. Lots of us just think it sort of happened with, and lots of people need to know, because while you can't transfer the model of peace here, you can take some really valuable lessons, and we think we're playing an important part of that. So again, congratulations to the Speech Summit for what they've done, and we're delighted to be with it, and really looking forward to hearing Candice later. Thank you.
Thank you, Paddy, and again, thanks very much for the support of the IFI. I know you're all wanting to hear from Candice, so let's do that. We're going to start with about 20 minutes from Candice, and I know many of you might have heard her on the radio today or looked at the website, but I do want to introduce you formally, even though people might know a little bit. Candice is going to tell her about her story, so I'm not going to mention that. But people like the Dalai Lama have listened to Candice's story. She's one of Vogue magazine's top 33 most inspiring women, along with Michelle Obama, Malala. She was named as the top 20 of African women by the African Union and the United Nations. In 2020, as the United Nations celebrated 75 years, it picked 75 people around the world to represent its aspirations, and Candice was one of those 75 people, which is quite phenomenal. Her story is featured in a documentary called It's a Pleasure to Meet You. She's published a book called Forgiveness Redefined about her story, which is incredible to read. She is a multi-award-winning speaker, an international podcaster, a TEDx speaker, a mentor of a range of people in different continents. And so it's just fantastic that she's here to share her story with us tonight, and thank you very much.
Firstly, I want to say thank you so very much to Brandon, who says that he was really brave to come and meet me, which makes me question how aggressive I look, because I was like, I hope it didn't take that much bravery. But thank you for having me here, and Pat, thank you, and everyone that's made this possible. It's been such an incredible day for me. And like Brandon said, we spend so much time with young peace builders, and it is always so inspiring in a world whereby everyone is an activist on Twitter, and everyone wants to have a say, but they don't want to actually do the work. It's incredible to be surrounded by people who are doing the work. and are starting to do it at a very young age of 15, 16, 17. And I'm like, my goodness, I wish I met them when I was that age, because goodness, I was a mess. But, you know, there's something that Pat and I spoke about just before I got on. So you didn't say it, but I'm going to say it. And we were speaking about whenever you speak or look at conflict zones and peaceful states, we always celebrate the hero, right? The person at the end who picks up the trophy. And when you said this to me, it was so impactful, because in many ways, with the accolades and the achievements, it's really lovely. But I am under no illusion that I represent that trophy winner, right? I am a South African, but I am one of many of my people that do not get to stand on the stage, that will never get this opportunity to tell their stories. And that is why I treat it with such respect, and I treat everyone who listens to me with such respect, because I am not only telling my story, I'm telling the story of my entire people. And so what is the story? You are all in Northern Ireland, and I'm sure you are very familiar with South Africa and the history of my country. So I know I don't look older than 21, but but I am 33 years old. And so what that defines me as in my country is a born free. So what born free means is that you are born free from the repercussions of apartheid, which is a really interesting concept when you think about it, because one is born at a certain time while people in my country were still dying. And all of a sudden, because you're reaching consciousness, you are no longer impacted by the past. So it's a really interesting concept. And I know here in Northern Ireland, kids are called the ceasefire generation. And so they shouldn't complain, because you don't know what happened, right? You did not go through what we went through, but we are dealing with the consequences of what you went through. And so that's very much my story. And so I'm going to take you back to 1991 when I was born. Yes, I'm 33. And so when I was born in the beautiful country of South Africa, that's known for a lot of things. I'm sure we could all name things that we've heard of or love about South Africa, right? There's warm people, the wine farms, the food that's very cheap but very good. So we can name all these incredible things. But in 1991, those privileges that I've just mentioned were reserved for a very select few people. And so when I was born, my dad was 24 years old, and my mom was 23 years old. And 9 months after my birth, my father was brutally murdered by an apartheid assassin by the name of Eugene de Kock. And so growing up, I had no conscious idea of what this meant for me. I knew I didn't have a normal family, but I didn't understand what that was. I didn't have a father, and I was okay with that. However, I reached the age of 9, and I remember my mom purchased a book. And on the book, it was written, Into the Heart of Darkness. And the author was Jack Poe. And so every time we would get visitors, my mom would send me to go get this book. And I would run, and I'd get the book, and I'd take it to her, and she'd shoo me out of the room really quickly. But I started getting really curious, because every time I gave her this book, whoever was listening or was watching or was in that room would start screaming hysterically or crying. And I used to think to myself, what is in this book? And so one day I started playing around the area that they were, and I was listening to what they were looking at. And I remember hearing that it was a picture of my dad. And so I got so excited, and I started scheming about how I was going to see this picture of my dad. Because at this time, I'd only owned about 3 or 4 pictures. So one day I got my golden opportunity. My mom had to go buy something, and I remember watching her reverse out of the driveway, and I ran up to the room really quickly. I grabbed the book, I sat at the edge of the bed, and I started paging through. But now as an adult, I can see that I started feeling anxiety as I was paging through. And so when I got to the page that I'd overheard, the picture that I saw was my dad's burnt body clutching a steering wheel, and his eyes were protruding. And so that picture was burnt into my mind. And from the age of 9, I was not the same person. I was depressed. I did not like people. I did not trust people. And I remember teachers would say to my mom, "Oh my goodness, Candice is so mature for her age." And what many people don't realize is that when a child matures quickly, it's usually because they've experienced some sort of trauma. So that was my first contact with my dad, his legacy, and what had happened to him. So fast forward, I get to around the age of 16. And I go to bed one day, and I'm an athlete. I was eating super well. I was highly competitive. But I started having this pain in my chest. And I remember thinking, I think I'm having a heart attack. So I rushed to my mom's room, and I said to her, I think I'm having a heart attack. And so my mom rushed me to the hospital. I was kept overnight. And the next day, the doctor asked to sit with my mom and I. And he said to us, in my over 20 years of experience, I have never seen stress symptoms so severe in someone your age. And he followed with the words, your body is killing you. And if you don't change what you're doing, you're going to die. And so at that point, there was a lot of thoughts going through my mind. And a part of me was suicidal anyway. So I was like, well, if I go this way, it's going to be easier. But I remember a few weeks or months passed, and I was walking from training, and a thought hit me. And the thought was, Eugene de Kock killed your father, and now you're letting him kill you too. And that became the moment that changed my life. From that moment, I decided that I was going to live, I was going to survive, and I was going to figure out how to get through this. So fast forward, and I get to the age of 24, and I am thriving. I am living my best life. I feel like I'm on the other side of this. And I go home, and I remember my mom was at the top of the stairs, and she shouts down and she says, I got a call from the National Prosecuting Authorities, and they want to know if we want to meet Eugene. Those were words I never thought I'd ever hear in my life. And so I remember freezing, and I said to her, yes. And she said, well, if you don't want to go, if no one wants to go, then we don't have to go. But if one of you goes, I'll come along. And I said, yes, I'm going. And the reason for this isn't because I'm so brave or so enlightened. It was because I understood in that moment that if I did not do this, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And so the day came, my whole family decided to go. It was myself, my 2 brothers, my grandfather, and my mom. So we got to the prison, and it was an odd situation because I don't know when I say prison what you imagine, but I did not imagine walking into what looked like an old relative's apartment. It was warm, it was comfortable, it was cozy, there was tea and scones, and I was like, what is happening? And so they said, please, get some tea, get some scones, and we get our tea and scones, and we align ourselves at the table. So it's a long dining room table. And so I remember sitting at the end of the one side. Then it was my younger brother, older brother, grandfather, and my mother. And then on the other side was 2 seats. So it was for the warden of the prison and the National Prosecuting Authority member. Across from us were the guards, the wardens of the prison. And then next to me was the priest, and next to him was an empty chair. And so the priest said, this is how it's going to go. If you ever feel uncomfortable, let us know, but you're free to ask anything. Great. So we sat, and I'm speaking to my brother, and I remember turning around for some reason, and as though by magic, Eugene was sitting there. And the scariest thing was he looked exactly like every image he had haunted in my mind, like every presentation I'd seen growing up. He had not aged one bit. And I just held my breath, and I think the priest saw the shock in my face because he started the conversation. And he said, okay, let's start this. And he introduced my mother first, and he said, that's Sandra, Mama. widow of the deceased Glenn Mama. And Eugene leaned forward and said, "Pleasure to meet you." And then he leaned back. And with each and every one of us, he would say, "Pleasure to meet you." And he'd lean back. And so my mom asked the first question, and she said, "Eugene, I just want to know what happened to my husband." Because all we knew as a family was that my dad was classed a terrorist, and he was shot, and that was it. And so Eugene broke down exactly how he managed to kill my father. And he said to us that my father was identified by the government as a troublemaker. And so they needed to win over his trust before they could kill him. So what they decided to do was get an askari. So an askari is someone who works for both sides of the government. And he sent this askari to win my father's trust. And the askari would report back, and he'd go back and forth. And eventually he said, "I think I've got it." And so they said, "Okay, let him drive a man across the border, and then we're good." So the askari tells them, "This is what you need to do." My dad, thinking nothing of it, I'm sure, says, "Cool." So my dad starts driving about 45 minutes outside of town to a town called Nelspruit. And as he's approaching this bridge, he didn't know that Eugene de Kock was standing at the top of the bridge waiting for him. And on either side of the bridge were 4 men, armed. And as the minibus approached, they started firing at the minibus. When Eugene realized that my father wasn't coming to a stop, he ran down the bridge and he emptied out his magazine cartridge on my dad. When the car finally stopped and he still saw signs of life in the vehicle, he decided to douse them all in fuel and set them alight. And so that was the first time we had such a vivid image and experience of my dad's final moments. So the conversation continued, and throughout this whole experience, I couldn't say anything. And Eugene was sharing different aspects of himself and his life. And I remember my mom saying, "Eugene, I just want to say I forgive you." And I was like, "Okay." And then my grandfather said, "I forgive you." Then my 2 brothers said it, and then it got to me. And I said, "Hi, Eugene." And he looked at me and he said, "Hi." And I said, "I want to say I forgive you, but before I do, I need to ask you one question." And he said, "Anything. What's that?" And I said, "I want to know, do you forgive yourself?" And for the first time in that whole encounter, he was no longer stoic. He looked away and he wiped the side of his eye because a tear had come down. And he said, "When you've done the things I've done, how do you forgive yourself?" And I started to sob. I cried and I cried and I cried. But what surprised me was that I wasn't crying for myself. I realized that there was nothing this human being could say that could take away my pain. And there was nothing I could say to take away his. And so the encounter wrapped up. The priest asked if there's anything else. We said no. And then we were dismissed. And I stood up first. And so I walked around the priest and I went up to Eugene, who was still sitting. And I said, "Eugene, would you mind if I gave you a hug?" And he looked at me confused. And he stood up, towering over me. And he held me really tightly. And he said, "I am so sorry for what I've done. And your father would have been so proud of the woman you've become." And I remember thinking in that moment that the same hands that are being used to comfort me were the same hands that took away my father. I left that encounter and I decided to do what many would think is the unthinkable. And I decided to petition for Eugene's parole. He was not eligible for parole. He had been sentenced to 212 years in prison on 89 charges of murder. And I stated in my letter that I do not speak for all the victims, but I speak for myself. And what I see is a new South Africa, yet the person who commanded my father's killing, who was the president at the time, got the Nobel Peace Prize. And the man who pulled the trigger got a life imprisonment. And that to me was not justice. So thank you so much for allowing me to share my story with you today. It has been an incredible honor, and yeah, I think I'm going to get interviewed by Leona.
Never quite sure what to say after hearing you speak, so I probably won't say anything, but thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's always hard for me to hear it as a South African and all the complexity that brings up. What we're going to do now is Leona O'Neill, who is with us here at the university. Many of you will know her. Leona is a journalist in Northern Ireland for nearly 25 years. She works in the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish News, Al Jazeera, Vice News, and many others. She is now the head of undergraduate journalism at the university, which is brilliant for us, really brilliant. And for the last number of years, when I said to her, tell me how you want me introduced you, she said she enjoys leading the next generation into an industry she loves so much. So that's a beautiful way of putting it. So I really look forward to your interaction, and we'll just leave it to you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and thank you, Candice. That was so moving. I was nearly in tears there, just even in listening to you. It must be very... it must be hard to talk about that kind of stuff, that trauma that has consumed, I suppose, your life and your family's life. And thank you so much for sharing it with us. And in this kind of intimate setting, it was really special. Northern Ireland has learned so much from, with regards peace building, from South Africa. Can you tell me about the South Africa that your parents grew up in? What was that from your mum's stories? What was that like?
Yeah, it was a very different South Africa to the one, of course, I experienced. And it was different for my dad as much as it was for my mom, because I don't know how many of you know Trevor Noah, but he wrote a book called Born a Crime. And so my mother was born a crime because she was a mixed-race child. And so her whole childhood meant that she was hiding. She was being hidden by different families. People were trying to take her from her home. They tried to take her from her school when they realized that her mother was black. So she had a very different experience. And then my dad, who was a black man who had gone through so much trauma already. So my dad knew that, being young, being black was what was considered a curse. Yet what I appreciate about him is I found journals that he kept, and his mindset was so powerful. He would script things like, your skin color is not a curse. Your mind matters more, what your mind can think of, it can achieve. You are limited by your own mindset. And so he had a really great outlook. And everyone who speaks about my dad will always say that if there's one thing he knew how to do was milk every moment of joy. That man was not going to leave a good time unless he had to. So yeah, I think as much as it was a troubled South Africa, I think both of them took the joy and the pain.
And you were talking there about, people painting a picture of your father for you. That must have been tough as well. You obviously have no experience of him at all. What kind of picture were they painting over the years? I'm sure you've met people who knew him and grew up with him and whatnot. What picture was painted of him for you?
Yeah, it was great because I got to formulate my dad, right? And I just want to touch on something which I'm sure sometimes people think but feel like it would be insensitive to ask. Which is, I never knew my dad. So some people would say, well, it must be easier because you never got to know him. Therefore, what are you really mourning? And the truth is, I think there's two different types of grief. Grieving someone that you knew, could touch, could spend time with, because in that grief, you got to know the person holistically. You got to see their flaws and their joy and all the good and the bad and everything in between. When you mourn someone you've never met, the problem with that is you create the most idealized version of them. because they never have the opportunity to disappoint you. They are your Superman. You fantasize about, oh, my life could have been so much better if this one human being was still on earth, right? And so the stories I told myself about my dad were very idealized in the beginning. But then as I grew older, I started seeing the nuance in his character. So he was 24 when he passed away, but when people speak about him, you'd swear they're speaking about a 60-year-old man, because he loved music, he loved to dance, he loved a good time. But also, everyone would say to me, when my dad was set on a goal, nothing could shift him from it. And when he got set on taking on the regime, nothing could move him from his path. And so he was a very resilient man, and also fun, because, you know, I love a good time, even though I talk about serious stuff.
What impact did his loss have on your family? You were only 9 months old. Your mother was thrust into widowhood, and you had brothers also, and his parents. It must have been absolutely awful for your mum and for everyone around that. How did you all cope in those years, even leading up to you actually saw the image in the book? How did you cope? Do you remember being different? Do you remember, you know, your mum treating you any differently or anything like that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing with loss, right? So often when we imagine someone being pulled out of an ecosystem, we assume that the system they pulled out of remains the same. But the problem is it never does. And so as a result of my dad's passing, I grew up in a broken home. My mom was a wounded woman who had to go identify her murdered husband and see his burned body. I did not have that. You know, so when she would raise us, she raised us in the best way she knew how, which was, I'm feeding you, I'm clothing you, you've got a roof over your head. So we never had space for emotions and that kind of rhetoric in our house. It was about, you get things done and you get out, and you face the world because the world is harsh. And so when I reflect on my family, even today, I see the brokenness. And I see how in many ways I've escaped the brokenness, and yet you still get pulled into waves of it. Because the one thing about healing, you cannot pull people along. You can give them tools, you can give them support, and you can give them the reassurance that you'll always be there, but you cannot do the hard work of healing for them. And so, yeah, my childhood was that of trauma, because that's what situations like this bring.
Here in Northern Ireland, so many families have suffered a loss like yourself, and there's almost a community of them. I don't know if it's the same in South Africa, where there were people that you could talk to, people that you could relate to, people who had the similar experience to you. Did you find that, or did you feel quite isolated in your experience?
I feel like it could have been different in South Africa, and the reason for that is we almost overnight went from segregated to integrated. So I went to school with all black kids, then I went to school with white, black, and everybody in between. And so we didn't have the space to collectively grieve and mourn and think and reflect. We were just living through the new cycle. And I feel like there was actually more of a guilt if you didn't appreciate the fact that you had this new opportunity and lease on life. How dare you take us back? Why would you want to talk about that painful time? And to this day, so many people will say, it was so long ago, just get over it. You know, and so I think that is South Africa. I think it's beautiful in a sense, because we have managed to do so much and move forward so quickly. But I do think that so many people that were impacted by the trauma almost feel silenced. And that's why even when I started this talk, I am incredibly privileged. I am privileged to be sitting in front of you, because in my country, people who look like me and, you know, have my same story may come from an uneducated background. They may be a domestic worker. They may not look a certain way and carry themselves a certain way, and then they just don't get listened to. They get lumped into the people that are filled with trauma over there. And because I don't look like the typical victim that we've seen on screen, I've been given a voice to represent all the unseen people. So I don't take that lightly.
Do you feel you were sheltered from the reality of your father's death when you were a child? And you mentioned there when you were talking about the book and you saw that for the first time, and that was such a stark, graphic, horrible, brutal image. How did you feel actually? I know you were 9, but how did you feel actually viewing that image? That must have been horrific for you.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I had a very unconventional childhood because when my dad passed away, my mom did the best thing she thought to do at that time, and she sent me off to live with my great-grandmother. And so she stayed with my older brother. I lived with my great-grandmother. So that was normal to me. Like life on the farm was great. And then I came to the city when I was around 5. And then I lived with my grandmother. And so I knew my mom from a periphery perspective, not so much as a maternal figure. And then I only lived with my mom at around the age of 8. And that's when I realized the complexity of our family and that not everyone lives with every lineage in their female matriarchal line. I was like, oh, you never lived with your great-grandmother? That's so weird. But yeah, so I think my mom did the best she could, and I'm really grateful for it because I got to see different parts of South Africa and I was exposed to it firsthand. And so by the time I saw the book and I experienced that trauma, it was devastating, but I wouldn't change it because I wouldn't be where I am today.
You obviously internalized a lot of that also as a child, and you were talking about, you know, you had the heart problems. Did you realize at that age what that was? Did you realize you were traumatized? Did you normalize it, or did the realization of all of that come at a later date?
I was very lucky because my mom forced us to read. So we had to read all kinds of literature. And one of the texts that she had bought was Napoleon Hill, and it was also The Secret. It was in that wave of the mind power movement and the, you know, hippie stuff. No offense to anyone who's a hippie in here. But it was in that movement, you know, of all of a sudden realizing how the mind impacts the body impacts the mind, etc. So I was very lucky to have been exposed to those works, even though it wasn't something that I completely believed in. And I do think that leaning into it too much can do more damage than good, because if you believe you are responsible for every single thing that's happened to you, that doesn't leave you much room to heal and navigate the pain of loss and the messiness of that. But what I did realize was that every time I'd see Eugene's picture or he was up for parole, I had a physical reaction. So I knew that there was something linked. And so had I not had the access to those books, I'm not sure I could have tied the two together.
What were your teenage years like? Because in our teenage years, we often find ourselves, and you told us there, you found yourself angry and depressed. What was it like navigating those years?
So for me, navigating my teenage years was probably like navigating my childhood. So because trauma forces you to grow up so quickly, I felt like I was an adult at 9. Okay, I was having gossip sessions with my mom's friends. I was like, "Tell me more, Teresa. Pour the tea." And so by the time I got to a teenager, I'd already skipped the childhood part. I'd skipped the teenage part. I was just an adult. I was just responsible for everything that was happening, and how I de-stressed was through competitive sports. And so all I did was just train and train and train. And that's how I could detect that there was something off when I went to bed that one night. But like I said, you know, when you do have traumatized families, it's kind of like every man fends for themselves, and you don't have, I always joke with my younger brother, because I say to him when he would throw these teenage temper tantrums, I'd say, you are so lucky, because we did not have the luxury of doing all of this, you know? So yeah, I'd say I skipped my teenage years and just went from 9 to adult.
So you told us there, when you were in your 20s, your mum said, look, do you want to meet your father's killer? What was going through your head at that moment when you had built him up as a monster? I would imagine at that stage you had built it's like the bogeyman, like a monster, because he had consumed your life. He had taken so much stuff from you. How did you feel in that moment that your mum said, do you want to meet it? Were there conflicting feelings, or was it just yes straight away?
It was definitely an out-of-body experience, because it's one of those moments you never think is going to happen to you until it happens to you. And all I remember thinking, and that kept running through my head, was, what if you never get this opportunity again? What if you never get to ask him the questions you have? What if, you live with this regret forever? And so that's why the yes for me was so sudden and immediate, because I just didn't want the regret of not knowing. And I was willing to deal with the pain of him exhibiting traits of lack of remorse, or him not being apologetic or arrogant, or all of that. But I felt like I was used to pain, and so I could handle it and move past it. But if I never did it, I would constantly be living in that regret cycle of what if, and I didn't want that.
And what was it like sitting in the prison waiting for him? What was it like him coming in and being face to face with this man who has haunted your entire life? What were the emotions going through your head? What did you expect from him, and did he fulfill those expectations?
Ironically, I expected nothing. And I know it's an interesting thing to say, but when you've grown up with this boogeyman or this figure over your head, you've created pretty much every imaginable scenario in your mind about who this person is. So I had no expectation of how he was going to come across, who he was going to be to us, if he was even going to talk to us, to be quite frank. But I think, I don't know how many of you know, like, experience this or have it in your own families, but my family deals with trauma through humor. So we just laugh about everything. Like, it could be the saddest thing, and we are cracking jokes. Like, there's 1 minute of like, oh, wow, that happened to you. And then next thing you know, someone comes from the kitchen and they just give a sly joke about it. Like, oh, we always knew. So we were dealing with it in that way. We were cracking jokes, we were teasing each other. But I will say that him, because I didn't see him walk in. He was just there. And so I think that was the moment of shock and realization and bringing me back into my body. Because up until that point, I think I was just outside of myself. I was just kind of like, what am I doing? Like, what's this, And then when he appeared, it all of a sudden became very real that, oh, we're really doing this.
And when he recounted your father's murder, did his truth, did it hurt you more, or did it heal?
So it was a little bit of both, but in the sense that all of a sudden you get a truth that you were denied pretty much your whole life. We knew my dad had died gruesomely. There were reports in the newspapers saying, terrorists killed in a shootout with police. So we knew aspects, but I think him retelling it, because he's got a photographic memory. So he lives with this very detailed memory of my dad, and I'm sure many others. So hearing that was like someone had kicked you in your stomach, and you kind of just reliving it through the lens of, the person you love. And so I'm not going to lie and pretend that it was an easy experience. It definitely felt as though I was reliving the trauma. I was reliving the moment that my dad took his final breath.
Did Eugene ask for forgiveness, or was it given willingly at that stage?
He didn't. And it's an interesting one, because I've asked myself this, right? I left the prison, I petitioned for his parole, he received it, I'm 24, thrown into the public limelight. And you reflect a lot between the moment of penning the letter to hearing that, the justice system has agreed with your letter to the man being released. You have so many moments of questions and wondering, like, did he play me? Was he remorseful? Is he a good actor? Like, did I miss anything? And to be quite honest, he didn't need to ask, because his actions told me that this is a wounded man. And so there are stories in between in the whole encounter that, of course, I don't go into detail with, and some were told in confidence and I'll never reveal them, but they gave me a detailed encounter into the psyche of this man. And I think it was so much easier, and I think for many of us, it's so much easier thinking that evil exists outside of us, that they're evil people and they're good people. But if that was true, we could just ship the evil people onto an island and we'd all be living in harmony. But we know that that's not a real reality, because with the right set of circumstances, many of us would do things that we would never imagine. And that's what I learned in that encounter.
And walking away from the prison that day, did you feel relief? Was it like two prisoners were almost released, you and he? Is that what it felt like?
Yeah, definitely. I wrote that in my book, that it was this really interesting experience. But I think what I experienced was interesting because we only sat with Eugene for about 45 minutes. But when I tell you, I felt like I'd been in a boot camp. My body was exhausted. I couldn't speak. I couldn't process. There was just so much overstimulation that had happened in that moment. And so it was only in the next day that I could really reflect and realize how much lighter I felt, And I think the reason I speak about forgiveness is definitely not to tell people you should forgive. You need to do this because it's the right thing to do and it's God's will and we've heard it all, right? Forgive and forget, forgive and move forward, forgive and this. And so even writing my book, forgiveness was a really tricky one for me to grasp because I thought, I don't define forgiveness the way I was taught forgiveness. Forgiveness to me was a very selfish act. It wasn't for Eugene. Yes, he received the branch of forgiveness and the extension of that forgiveness. But by forgiving Eugene, I was really setting myself free. I was healing myself and I was refusing for him to control any other element of my life. And so, I think I deviated from the question, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, you advocated for his parole, and did you stay in contact after this? What is your relationship with him now? Have you got one?
Yeah, so after he received his parole, both of us were in a lot of media. And in that moment, I realized that forever, from this moment forward, when people say Candice Mama, there's Eugene is going to pop up. And every time people say Eugene, my face is going to be like, and so it was interesting because all of a sudden my identity had been crafted by a moment that was actually an intimate moment. And because of his reputation and profile, it became a public moment, which I completely understand. But when he was released on very stringent conditions. And I remember someone asking me, you petitioned for his parole, would you have a coffee with him? And I said, well, this could go one of two ways. I could have petitioned for his parole and he's a psychomaniac and he goes off and he does unimaginable things. And I'm going to be responsible. And I'm like, he could also go off and go plant trees and do good for the world. And I would have no accountability for that, right? And if I expect everyone else, everyone in this auditorium, everyone in South Africa to deal with him in a human interaction, then I would be a hypocrite not to want to spend time with him after prison. And so the only reason we haven't done coffee is because of his very stringent bail conditions. And we have communicated through letters and we've got a mutual friend. It's very covert, you send a letter to this one and then they send it back. But it's only because, the government doesn't trust them to be out. So we'll trust them in the sense of what he will tell the world.
It takes an enormous amount of compassion to free someone who hurt you from their guilt and their pain. Do you think that we all have that compassion in us, or is it something that you have learnt yourself or learned to cultivate yourself?
After having done this work for close to 10 years now, the most common thing I hear from people is, love your story, so great, thanks for sharing. But I could never. And it's always funny to me because I could have never either. So we all are walking this path where we have incredible capacity. We have an incredible capacity to love. We have an incredible capacity to hate. And we are not linear human beings. Like human beings aren't designed in silos. We all have capacity within us. We just need the right impetus to do the right thing. And so when you hear stories from other people, the reason as human beings we gather to listen to one another's stories is because we find a mirror within a story. And the only reason you connect with my story is because you see an element of your story in it. And the truth about trauma is, I hate to break it to everyone, but none of us are going to escape this life unscathed. And if you've done it so far, congratulations, but life is coming for you. And I think it's all about contextualizing how we view trauma and how we view forgiveness, because sometimes I think human beings have the incredible capacity to downplay their pain. So they'll say to you, yeah, you know, my dad abandoned us, but I'm fine. I don't care. I'm good. I mean, I'm married. I'm fine. And you realize the pain and the isolation that person is feeling, but refusing to recognize. So I think that when we forgive, and we forgive ourselves first and foremost, and then perhaps forgive the person who's caused us pain, what that will prevent in the future is what we see in the world today, which is when you look at politics around the world today, it's a whole bunch of little boys cosplaying as adults. They are all wounded. Donald Trump is a wounded man. He's a man in pain. And the only way he gets that attention and he gets us all to listen and pay attention is when he says and does outrageous things. Where do you see that behavior? In little boys. Because they don't know how to articulate what they need. And so when we heal ourselves and we embark on that journey of doing the unthinkable, as we like to say, I'd like to think that we're forming a better society.
In your eyes, then, what is exactly is forgiveness? Is it forgetting also, or just the one, just forgiveness? Do you forget also?
Wow, there's one saying that will get under my skin, and that is forgive and forget. I think it would be one of the stupidest things for any human being to do, to forget the fundamental situation that has made you who you are. We are all crafted by the different stories that we encounter on our life journeys. And so forgetting is not even on the cards, because even if you wanted to, you couldn't do it, right? So for me, forgiveness is about realizing that trauma is an interesting thing because the human brain is interesting. Our human brain does not realize when something is actually happening to us versus when it's an imagined reality or we're watching something. And how do you know this? When you watch a horror movie, you know you are safe in your house. But why is your heart racing? Why are you hiding? Why are you scared to switch off your lights when you're going to bed? You know that character doesn't exist, yet your body is reacting to the stimulus that you have given it. And so trauma is exactly the same. When we experience trauma, that's our first point of contact with the pain. The problem becomes when we relive that trauma, we are continuously re-traumatizing ourselves. So it's like a scab. You keep picking at it and it keeps bleeding, so it never heals. And what forgiveness is, it's a narrative change. And the narrative is, I refuse to be a victim to this any longer. I'm going to be the victor of this situation, and I'm going to take back my own power. Because the trauma may not be our responsibility, but the healing is. And so when we take back the power of our stories, what we're saying is, that person who hurt me no longer has the power to dictate how I move through my life. Because the problem with pain is, we don't think we're acting out of a place of pain, but if you are walking around with a bleeding, gaping wound, you are going to bleed on people that did not hurt you. And no matter how much you try and avoid it, you're going to bleed all over your kids, you're going to bleed all over your spouse, because you are punishing other people for what one individual or those people did to you. And when you realize that, what are those people doing? Because I had this one thought once while I was on the journey to forgiving Eugene. And it was like, oh my gosh, I am in this panic body state. I was having palpitations, sweating, so angry. And I was like, what is Eugene doing right now? The man is probably eating an apple in his prison cell and he does not even know I exist. Yet he had so much power. he was controlling my life. Everything I did was dictated by Eugene. And until I forgave him, I did not have freedom. And only after releasing that pain could I actually start to live.
I was just going to say, actually, here in Northern Ireland, we know so much about suffering, and I've spoken to people in the last couple of days whenever I was saying I was going to interview you, and they said, I could never forgive the person who did this hurt to me. And I was going to ask you, how do we here in Northern Ireland get to that place of forgiveness? How do you get people to get to that place where they forgive the person who hurt them? But I think you answered it so beautifully there. I'll maybe the last question. You were at the very start. You were talking about the picture that was painted of your father for you growing up. What do you think he would think of your journey thus far?
Wow. I mean, so many times I envision my father and the life that he lived and the legacy he created at such a young age. And I remember when I hit the age, because when you are 16 and 15, 20 years old, you are like, wow, the elders, the adults. And so that's the picture I had of my dad for a very long time, the elder. And I remember hitting the age of 24 and I had a complete mental breakdown. I started crying because I realized that he managed to squeeze so much into his life. And I was 24 still figuring out what I'm doing with mine. And so when I think of the sacrifice and the knowing sacrifice that he, embarked on, and I look at my life today and how I am, my friends, and if we talk, you'll realize I am a complete goofball. Like, don't take me seriously. But I love laughing. I love dancing. I don't take myself too seriously. And I think that's what I've learned from walking alongside my dad. And so I think he'd be proud because we are having a lot of fun together, okay? Every time I'm dancing alone, he's somewhere there, like, doing the Boogie Wonderland song. So yeah, I'd like to think he'd be proud of not just me, but the progress that he died for, actually taking action in real life.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful words. Have we got questions from the audience? Have we got a roving mic?
Hi, thank you so much. My question just goes back to when you had hugged the man and when you left. I suppose I want to know, in terms of your family, you had siblings and you had your mum was there, your grandparent was there. How did they react? Like, you showed this incredible, almost not human level of compassion, this emotion that a lot of people, even in this room, probably can't relate to. What was the reaction of your immediate family? Have they come to terms with the incredible being that you are in that respect? That's basically it, and thank you again.
Thank you. And sorry, what's your name?
I'm Joseph. Hi.
Joseph. Hi, Joseph. And thank you for the question. So my family collectively forgave Eugene. If anything, it started with my mom, and all of us were forgiving in a row, if you will. I don't know if my family looked at it in that sense, because the thing is, it's one thing for me to be sitting in front of all of you today and sharing this on behalf of many South Africans, not just my family, but many others. Whereas when you are the part of the process and you're part of the pain journey and the forgiveness journey, you realize that it becomes so natural to step into that. I'm a natural hugger. I love a good hug. And so personal space during COVID was not my thing, so I locked myself up. But to me, that's what being a human being is, right? To exchange that moment and to say, we have just shared a moment that many people will never have. And even if I walked away with nothing at that, just that embrace alone would have been etched into my memory for the rest of my life. And thank you.
Over here.
Candice, thank you very much. It's been inspiring to hear what you've said this evening. I visited South Africa actually in 1995. I was very fortunate. I was able to spend 6 weeks there. And it is a beautiful country. I was able to go from Palabora down to Cape Town, Kimberley, etc. I was actually based in Johannesburg. Nelson Mandela had just taken over. When I returned, I read a book called Knowledge in the Blood. I don't know if you know the book. It was about a black lecturer who joined one of the universities, and he was lecturing Afrikaners. And he talks about the difficulty because of the legacy that the students held of when the Afrikaners were in power and the difficulties of that. I was wondering, has South Africa now moved beyond that? And could you comment, if you can, on the effectiveness and impact of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question. So it is important to always look at progress and to see where we were 30 years ago versus where we are today. And when you look at that kind of escalated progress, where we literally turned a page and we were an integrated society, it's going to come with teething problems. So I like comparing countries to people. And the reason I do that is because when we realize that no one in the world would elect a 30-year-old politician to be president, yet we expect a 30-year-old democracy to have it all figured out and know what they're doing. So as far as the integration process, it's still occurring. But as we know with any conflict around the world, that progress is slow, especially when economics have been a major factor in keeping people segregated. And so I think the reason we're not probably seeing the rapid fire integration that we would like to see is because many people are still living in poverty. So many people are still living below the poverty line of all races. And we are starting to see it escalate in South Africa. And so I'm finding South Africa to be interesting at the moment because I'm not finding it to be as racially combative as people would assume we are, as much as it's become very classist. The haves are protected and they have their own little silo in society, and the have-nots are treated as though them resorting to crime is because they're bad people, when the truth is, when you are struggling to put food on the table and you are having wealth flaunted in front of you and you're seeing Bentleys and all this extravagance in your face, what do you expect people to do? And so I think South Africa is in a new transition at the moment where it isn't a racial issue. It's definitely going to be about how we deal with the economic inequality in the country. And I'm so sorry, I know you had a part 2 to the question.
If you can, on the Truth and Reconciliation.
Yes, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I mean, as with any conflict process, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee had incredible benefits, and my family was one of the families that benefited from that process. But it also had its flaws. And so it's very important when we're looking at methodologies and we say, okay, well, that worked for you, let's bring it over here, that we realize the inherent flaws that are there for every single system. And one thing people tend to overlook with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is the fact that, yes, people were allowed to come, seek amnesty to tell the truth, and families were awarded justice and a sum of money. But many people are under the conception that people were just, jailed for their crimes. And I hear that a lot, especially when it comes to Eugene, where people will be like, yeah, but the TRC was so good because Eugene, look at him, he's such a great example. I'm like, the reason we're pinpointing Eugene and not the many others that he worked alongside is because Eugene messed up in his testimony at the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And had he told the whole truth and nothing but the truth, he would have never been sentenced to those 212 years. So when we're looking at seeking truth and we're looking at seeking justice, it's very important to realize that there is a balance. And although the process was very effective and as effective as it could be, I think if it was to be re-implemented into different societies, it would need to be tweaked a little bit. But I think it was a great process. Thank you.
Here at the front?
Yes.
Oh, and then John after yours.
My name's Nicole. We met earlier. It was lovely to meet you. My question was, I was just sitting listening to your story and I thought, wow, like I've heard it. I was lucky to hear it earlier as well. But when was the first time that you decided to share your story? What was your motivation to do it? And like, how was that very first experience? What was that like? Because obviously you've done it so much and you've got to this stage. So I'd love to hear where that journey began. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole. So it's actually very interesting. So what happened was I advocated for my dad's murderer's parole, and he gets it, and all of a sudden my phone, my Facebook, my Instagram, everywhere you could find me was blowing up. Like people wanted to find me. And so for 2 weeks in a row, like it was just crazy, where I was doing an interview morning, afternoon, evening, you know, people were asking, people were curious, somewhere in the world. And then I got to a point where I said, I'm done. I'm not doing any more interviews. I'm not speaking about this anymore. Like, this is a chapter closed, all the good things. Then I got an invite from one of our big chancellors in South Africa, Professor Jonathan Jansen. And he invited me to speak at the University of the Free State. And he said, hey, I understand you're probably done. Like, you don't want to do this. But as your final hurrah, just come and speak to the students at the University of the Free State. And I thought, you know what? Yes, I'm going to put it, all the detail here. And if ever anyone wants to hear the story, they can just get it from there. So I went to the university and it was great. And I shared my story much like I did today in a little bit of a longer format. You know, I hadn't been trained to be concise at that time. And I remember the Q&A session opening. And the first person stood up and they said, I was sexually assaulted by my uncle as a child and I've never told anyone. And then the second, I mean, even speaking about it now, it gives me chills. And then the second person stood up and they shared their trauma. And then everyone in the room just started sharing. And I started crying because I was like, oh my God, this is what people are feeling from the story. And I had a battle with myself after that for a while. And a part of me was like, go do war correspondence. That's what you wanted to do. You studied to be a journalist. But then I was like, it would be selfish to not share this if this is how it moves and impacts people. And so I remember when I started my career, I'd always give myself these random timestamps of expiry. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it for a year and then people are going to be sick of me. And then a year would lapse and more people would want to hear. And then I'd be like, okay, 2 more years, then I'm done. And now it's been almost 10. But I'm thinking 10 might be the one. Root for me.
Oh, that's you. Yeah. John, you have the mic there.
I'm blown away for the second time today because I heard you on the radio earlier. And just a question I wanted to ask you, and it's the whole thing around forgiveness, and particularly here in the North. You know, there have been 2 episodes that automatically came into my brain when I heard you speak earlier today. One was Gordon Wilson at Enniskillen, and the other was Richard Moore, who's from this city. And that thing about forgiveness, you know, is there an expectation from that? I think that if I can just get where I'm coming from in this, is there an expectation from that? Because the fear with forgiveness is that somebody feels that they're getting off the hook. It lets them away free. How do you have that unconditional forgiveness in a way that still expects somebody to have the responsibility of, if possible, putting their action right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one I think many post-conflict societies struggle with is the fact that many times we are expected to forgive. We are told to forgive. And when all else failed, we are ordered to forgive. And I think that is such a dangerous, dangerous thing, to force feed people something they are not ready to partake in themselves. So the reason I am so passionate about forgiveness, and I use the term forgiveness because I have not found another word that encompasses the process, is because the problem with rage and pain is whatever controls your emotions will control your life. If someone can get you in a heightened state, they have power over the decisions you're going to make. If you think about moments when you've been in rage and the actions you've committed in those moments of rage, and you think, I don't know what came over me. It was like I was in a different world. And so when you are dealing with someone who has caused you great harm, and you are dealing with them from a heightened state, they have the power. They are holding that control in their hands because they can say anything to you. And they can manipulate you and turn you, and they know that they've got those switches to your emotional buttons. So the process of forgiving is saying, I refuse to be controlled by this any longer. I'm releasing this burden that was placed on my shoulder, and I'm letting it go. And then you embark on a dance of forgiveness. Because unfortunately, forgiveness is not a linear road. You don't start here and end over there. You are going to start here, come here, then go back, then go here, then go back, then go here, then go back. And it becomes like a weird ping pong game. But one day you wake up and you realize, I don't feel that anymore. Actually, no, that's not there. And when you're operating from a state of clarity, I think you're actually in a much more empowered position to seek the justice that you are looking for. Because you can articulate yourself better. You can see through the manipulation from the person who's causing you the trauma and playing on your emotional triggers. And so for me, it's a very nuanced thing. Because forgiveness, yes, is about the other person in the fact that the other person has caused you pain. But it is not about them at the same time. It is about you being able to raise your kids without crying every night in bed. It's about you being able to raise your kids without replicating the trauma you experienced onto them. It's about giving them a better shot at life than the one you had. And the only way I have seen, and I'm open to learning more from others, but the only way I've seen that happen effectively is when we forgive what has happened to us and make peace with the fact that we cannot rewrite history, but we can correct the future. And so correction of the future is the second part, which is, yes, I've forgiven you. Like, I forgave you for punching me, but I'm still calling the cops. Like, great, like that's, it's gotten, the two aren't linked. Forgiveness is not in the absence of justice. So, yeah.
Another question up here. Oh, we'll go this way first. Yeah, last two.
Thanks so much for such an inspiring talk. My question's similar to John, but slightly different. Do you think forgiveness is dependent on some form of recognition or accountability or remorse from the person that's harmed you? Would your reaction, did you move into a place of forgiveness due to Eugene's reaction when you met him, or had you already moved into that place? I'm just interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had already moved into the place, because that's the issue with forgiveness, right? We use it so interchangeably with so many different things, as to reconciliation is forgiveness, and the two are used so interchangeably. Whereas for me, what I had to recognize and realize in my experience and journey was that I was not living in alignment with what my father would have wanted for me, or any parent that loves their child would want for their child. I was in a state of so much consistent mental anguish and pain that I still have ulcers today because I developed them then. I still have health conditions today. Like, I changed my brain chemistry because I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and the neural pathways in my brain changed. So there were so many things that my body had to adapt to because I was in such rage, that I had to unlearn and undo and work through and start the process of that healing and that forgiveness. And so whether Eugene was apologetic or not, the reason I had the capability to sit in front of him and give him the opportunity to be whatever he was is because my state of being was no longer dependent on him. But the problem is, so often when we're in pain, we seek validation. And that validation, unfortunately, sometimes doesn't come. I remember confronting someone once, and I said to them, and this was really interesting, it was before this whole, forgiveness thing had happened. And they'd really hurt me. And I said to them, you know what? I want to tell you, I forgive you. And I remember him looking at me and he said, what on earth made you think I care about your forgiveness? And I was like, oh, well, damn. Okay, well, I'm just going to pack this up and go home. And it was such a pivotal moment for me because I realized that I could hold a grudge and resentment towards this person, Eugene, my mother, whatever, whoever, and that could control me for the rest of my life. And I could wait for them to validate my reality and experience and what I've gone through. Or I can take it upon myself and say, I trust myself. I trust and know what I've experienced. I trust and know that I'm stronger for it. I trust and know that this is not going to be the defining moment in my life. And I think the mistake we make in society is especially in conflict societies, we identify people so heavily with their pain. That is the victim of. That is the victim of. So we label. And so then people have to walk through the world with the burden of being a victim. What about them being a victor? Oh gosh, that person? Geez, man, that's the strongest person I know because they overcame this. Their gentleness is what makes them soft, not brute strength. And so I think it's very important to just realize and come to the realization that we don't need people to validate our pain. We need to believe we are good enough to validate it for ourselves. Then we need to allow ourselves to cry, experience, feel, and then let go of the burden that was never ours to carry.
Great answer. The last question up here. Go ahead, Lee.
Candice, thank you so much for sharing your stories today, and I'm most grateful to you for being so brave and so strong, and it really strengthens my belief that we have a lot to learn from young people from the conflict societies. Interestingly, throughout your talk, I've been thinking of two people. One is your mother, and the second is my own daughter, because I lost my husband and my son in an attack by an internationally proscribed organization 11 years ago, and my daughter was only 6 months at that time. So my question to you was, since you mentioned that you thought that maybe there was more space for emotions. So my first question is that I, as a mother, what can I do to create that space for my daughter so that she can, as you described very aptly, I could relate to it, putting food on the table, clothes, putting a roof over the head is sometimes, it takes me over. So what can I do as a mother to help her through the journey of her emotions? And the second thing is that because in our country we don't have any transitional justice systems, the perpetrators were hanged by the military court, so we never had an opportunity to talk to them, we will never have. So what would you suggest that when do I bring on these conversations about those gruesome details to my daughter? One would be the right time, and how can I bring it up, and how can I help her deal with it? Thank you.
Wow. Firstly, I want to say thank you for sharing that with all of us here, and I'm so sorry for your loss. And the fact that you're even asking the question, it means you're on the right path, right? So when I was growing up, and what I still wish for my mother today, was I wish that she wasn't so captive to her pain. And if I had seen my mother heal, to this day, that's the only thing I want for my mom. I want her to be happy. I want her to experience life. But she's built this fortress of pain around herself. And I think had I seen her model the fact that, hey, shit happens. Things suck. And you are in pain, and you're allowed to be in pain. Because what happened to us, we didn't deserve it. But you know what? We are going to make the most of it because they're not here to do that. And I'm going to heal, and sometimes I'm going to break down in front of you, and I'm going to cry, and that's okay. Because I think sometimes what we tend to do is we think of strength as this, we have to just rush through and move through. And I don't know if you can relate to this, but it's either you are destroyed by the pain or you become an overachiever because of the pain, right? So you're either in one or two camps. And I would say that it is all about embracing the emotional journey. So often I think what tends to happen with trauma is we've buried it so deep, we're afraid to even open that closet because we don't know what's going to come out from inside of us. But when we start peeling back the layers and we give ourselves permission to feel, because we need to survive. I don't have time to feel this. I don't have time for the pain. I don't have time to mourn this. And I think when you take yourself on this journey and you articulate to your daughter that, hey, like, we've gone through some stuff, but we're going to look at us like we are surviving, we've done stuff, but we want to do more than survive. We want to thrive. So let's unpack this together. If you're having a vulnerable moment and you need me to just listen and not talk, tell me. And I will be the person that you can speak to for that. And if you need that, you need to also find that in someone, whether it's a therapist, whether it's anyone, because there's so much power in verbalizing our pain and verbalizing our own stories. And I can honestly say you're obviously a great mother, because you being here, being so open, being so receptive, and even asking for this tells me you're a great mother. And when you heal yourself, oh my God, your daughter will thank you for it. And she will heal in turn. Thank you.
Amazing. How beautiful a moment. Absolutely gorgeous. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful words, inspirational words for us all. I mean, we're all we're all living in Northern Ireland now, or we all have some experience of trauma or loss, and I think we will all take away a really profound message from today. I know I will anyway. And thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and thank you for being so open and amazing.
Candice was born in South Africa 33 years ago. I went to South Africa 33 years ago. Believe it or not, it's a strange story, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of it, but when I went there in 1991, it was to do work with the ANC and other then excluded parties. Obviously, Mandela had been released the year before. There was very questionable transition. Are there going to be negotiations? Is there not going to be negotiations? What's the shape of those negotiations going to be? We all know the story and we're familiar with the syndrome. But one of the things that the ANC wanted to do was to have their regional and local activists trained to be ready possibly for elections when they happened. And the strange thing was, I was part of what was ridiculously called an international faculty that did some work with the National Democratic Institute from the United States, but I was asked to bring polling booths because, of course, we have a factory in Derry and Springtown that makes these collapsible, portable polling booths, and so I brought polling booths to pre-democratic South Africa, 2 polling booths from London, so that they could be used as part of the training exercise for these various South African political activists in different parts of South Africa. We heard. Not only did I bring polling booths, also brought ballot papers from here, from Ireland, north and south. They would have been unused ballot papers from European elections and local elections. So many of the ANC activists were doing their first ballot experience using Irish ballot papers and a polling booth from here, and that was as far back as 33 years ago, and we know so many other changes since then. One of the things I remember about the South African legislation, because we had different experiences and interactions between Northern Ireland and South Africa, and Paul Arthur is here, and he was part of a trip that a number of us from a number of political parties did as well. But the Truth and Reconciliation legislation has been mentioned. The forward to that legislation, sort of the long title of the bill, but essentially the forward of the legislation, had this great phrase about, in order that we might, and it was might, leave the past behind us on an ethical basis. And that's the difference. That was the conscious thought about dealing in this imperfect process that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, when we listen to Candice's story, when she told us about the call that her mother got from the Chief Prosecutor's Office, the issue there was they were being given a choice. And Candice's family made a choice. Candice made her own choice then, as we heard, within the context of that visit, that meeting that took place. And of course, the difficulty that many people have here with legislation that kicks in next week is the choice will be gone, will be denied. And that's a difference. But this isn't just about us, it's not about our situation. We've heard powerfully emotive words from Candice, and we really appreciate that. And we know that Candice is not trying to set herself up as some sort of poster person for forgiveness, as the gold standard, or as anything else. And John tonight mentioned Richard Moore, and I'm very conscious Richard always talks about forgiveness as a gift that you give to yourself. But he's also very conscious about the fact that he respects the absolute integrity of the position of those who have been denied the chance or the opportunity or the reason to forgive or share forgiveness in the same way. And so we need to remember that, the integrity of Candice's story. We also need to remember the integrity of other stories and how people are coping with that as well. And we heard that so powerfully from Candice as well this evening. On behalf of the Hume Foundation, I obviously want to thank Leona for chairing. I want to thank Candice for what she has shared with us. I want to thank the university, Professor Hamber and Malachy, for hosting us here this evening, and of course for hosting the work of the Peace Summit today. I want to thank all of our partners in the Peace Summit. Too many to list, and I'm not going to go through the list, but it's appreciated. And of course the sponsors, and we heard from the International Fund for Ireland earlier. Another one of my experiences was to actually work with Tip O'Neill in relation to the creation, lobbying for the creation of the International Fund for Ireland. And one of the things that I learned from him in conversations was that the two most important things in politics and public life are the two things that politicians most forget. People want to be asked, and people want to be thanked. So I hope you're glad you were asked here this evening. We're certainly very glad that the questions that you were able to ask, and no doubt there are other questions you will want to ask. But I want to thank all of you for your presence. I hope all of you have been able to take something from it. And certainly I'm sure Candice has been able to take something from her engagement with the young people today. I had the opportunity to sit in just a little bit of the Peace Summit today. Didn't want to be coming in, an older person looking like an invigilator or something in that sort of sense. But the work of those young people and some of the issues that they were bringing up, and it put the thought in my head, these are young people who clearly know that my generation hasn't educated them very well about the past. Their generation can educate us hugely well about the future, and that's the important thing, and that's what a peace process and a transition to peace is meant to be about. It's about that emancipation for other generations. So I thank people on behalf of the Hume Foundation. I also want to thank our people in the Hume Foundation. I want to thank Tim Atwood and Colette for their work throughout today and for this evening, and all the work that has gone into it. That work goes on just as the work of so many of you in this room in so many ways. Work that is all part of the aggregate of dialogue and engagement that has made up our peace process. Too often we make the mistake of forgetting that our peace process has really been a long, slow murmuration with all sorts of involvements and movements and circles, and at times it's chaotic, and then every now and again it takes on a shape and a configuration and it means something, and then it appears to sink into chaos again and it comes back. But it's many of the partners who have worked with the young people in this process who have been responsible for that sort of work. So at times it's easy for people to think it's all the stuff that's going on at the political level or around negotiating tables and all the rest of it. It's all of the other unlikely and the difficult conversations that take place as well. So I want to thank our partners in the Peace Summit for all of their continuing work as well. as well as everything they've done to help us to achieve now. So with that, I wanted you just to join again in particularly thanking Candice, and I hope that the strength of your applause will radiate the appreciation that we all feel for what we have witnessed and been part of tonight. Thank you.